Hello, my name is Chris Douglas, and welcome to part 5 of my ongoing video presentation, AngularJS and SharePoint. So, after a whole lot of background explanations, and I'm sure if you sat through all of these, you're asking yourself, when do I get to see the code? When do I get to see the code? Well, I broke off the last video because I wanted to start the code at the beginning of a new part. So I wanted to give all of that background information so you can understand what's involved in building an Angular application. In future videos that I have in mind, I'm going to delve into very nitpicky, highly detailed aspects of using AngularJS and SharePoint. But the purpose of this video series was, how do I start from scratch and make an AngularJS application that runs against a SharePoint list? And that's my goal. And that's why I felt like I had to explain a lot of things to you. And so I gave you a whole lot of background. And hopefully, if you watch all of these videos in order, you can come back to part 5 and look at the code itself. And that'll help answer questions when you're trying to solve this on your own. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and we're going to open up SharePoint Designer and we're going to start with our first file. Okay, as you can see here, we're in the Cigars folder within Site Assets, and the first file we're going to look at is Cigars.html. This is the home page. This is the parent for all of the child HTML files within our application. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot in here. We have references for all of the libraries that we're using. You see jQuery, you see 3 Angular libraries, and then there are the references for the 3 JS files that our application is using: Cigars.js, Cigars.list.js, and Cigars.item.js, and the style sheet Cigars.css. And as you can see here, we have an h1 tag for our header, and within that, 2 divs. One has ng-app as an attribute, one has ng-view as an attribute. This is very important. Every AngularJS application has to reference the ng-app attribute in order to function. So, Mod Cigars is our application. We only have one application within this program. You can have multiple modules, but I recommend just having one. It simplifies things greatly. So our module, Mod Cigars, is the parent for all of the classes we're going to use. You can think of it as an assembly or a project if you're thinking in terms of Visual Studio. So we've defined a div and we've added the ng-app attribute that's telling the browser that, hey, we've got an AngularJS application and we're going to be referencing this module, and everything you're going to want is going to come from that module. You can embed the ng-app attribute inside of a panel, a TD tag, a div tag, a span, a body tag, the HTML tag for the whole page. I found it simpler in every instance just to use the div tag. It's clearly defined, it's neat, there's no other stuff we have to worry about. We simply define a div tag, we close it, we name the class if we care about the CSS, and that's it. So everything that happens within my Angular application is going to happen inside of this div here. Inside of that is the view div that uses the ng-view attribute, and notice it's just an empty string. This div here is where every child page is going to appear, because ng-route is going to put edit, display, or list where this div tag is. So these 2 divs define everything in our application. All right, here is the Cigars.js file. It is the main JavaScript file for our application, And its two main functions are to control routing of the child forms and to provide a factory to manage data shared between controllers. The way that AngularJS works, you have a controller loaded and then you can move back and forth between controllers, but they cannot share data. So there isn't a session or global variable that you can pass between them. So you have to create a factory. I would recommend Googling factory, provider, and service to understand the difference between these three mechanisms. But basically, a factory is a class that you can call from any controller, and it can store a variable that can be passed on to another controller. And I'll show that in a moment. So we see here that our app is defined. Our app variable refers to the Angular module mod cigars. Remember, in the ng app attribute we set in our main div, we referred to the mod cigars module. So this module is contains all of the controllers that we're using within our application. And it has these two directives. Basically, a directive is like a namespace. It's where you're allowed to load another set of classes for use in your application. If you wanted to use ng-route or ng-sanitize, I would need to reference them as directives like this. So we'll look at the route provider here. Basically, it's a switch statement. So if the fragment identifier, remember that's the pound sign and a UR and slash and other text after the pound sign, this tells the router where to send the data, where to send you. So if you pick display, we've got an item ID, which is the list item ID, and then a search variable. You notice that the pound sign, the colon tells it to expect a variable, and then the question mark makes that variable optional. So the search is not required, but that's going to call display.html, is going to call the item controller, and it's going to set the alias controller as VM. If you don't define display or edit, then it's going to default to basically looking for the search, which is optional. And then you notice that for the item, for both edit and new, we have a global variable that we can pass in. Basically, we can pass in our own route parameter variables, which is basically like the query string variables. So I'm passing in edit and making it true, or I'm going to pass in new and making it true. That's how I'm able to use both the item controller for both new and edit and not have to build a separate HTML file and controller to handle new and edit. I simply use this variable edit or this variable new to tell Angular what state I'm in. Okay, here we are with our factory data, and you'll notice that we have for a factory, much as like a controller, which we'll get to in a later segment, we have directives as well, and they're defined first in double quotes and then inside of the function as parameters without quotes. So Q and HTTP are both directives or namespaces, if you will, that contain classes or functions that we're going to use within our application. I'm going to make a separate video or series of videos to talk about exactly how to use HTTP to consume a REST API for SharePoint. Basically, that means that's how you do an asynchronous call from an AngularJS application to a SharePoint list to pull in data. I'm just going to touch on it briefly within this series of videos, but it deserves its own explanation at length. But it's enough to understand that we're using HTTP to make an asynchronous call to a URL we're passing in or we're going to construct, and that URL is going to tell Angular, give me the information from this list. And that's sufficient for this level of the tutorial, but it deserves more explanation on its own. So we see within our factory here, we're going to look at the return for a moment. You see that's very straightforward syntax. External to my data factory within one of the controllers, I'm going to call data, and I'm going to call the getFields method, and that's going to call the internal method getFields, and that's going to return data back to the user. I found that this means, although it looks like it's duplication, it's actually easier to understand once you start using it. It's much less complicated than some of the other ways I was doing factories in the past. So I'm defining a data object. This double curly brackets is basically saying I'm creating an object. If I was creating an array like data fields, which is a property of data, I'm going to use empty square brackets. So square brackets defines an array, curly brackets defines an object. You can have objects that have properties which are other objects, which are arrays. An array is going to have objects. So you can just keep building all the way down. But it's important to understand the difference between an object and an array. An object has properties. An object is basically class. An array is a collection of one or more objects. But you can certainly have an object that has an array as a property, and that array will have objects as members of that array. So we're starting off our function. We're calling getFields, and notice if you look down here, I'm not passing in any arguments in this getFields. However many arguments there are in the calling program, this piece of code doesn't care. But in the actual definition of the function, I'm requiring the list URL. Remember, this is a factory that has information outside of any controller. So when the controller calls it, the VM, which is the alias for the controller, is not available, and none of the properties of the controller are available. This is like a standalone, if you had like a methods class in C#, where you have static methods that get called. They only know what you pass to them. So I'm passing in the list URL for my list, the cigars list, http://douglasweb.com/list/cigars. But this function will take any list URL and give you the fields inside of it. So when we first call it, data fields has not been populated yet. Remember, I defined data here. So the first time anyone calls the data factory, data fields is going to be null. So it's going to skip this, it's going to go down here, and it's going to populate data fields. The second time it comes through, data fields is not null. So it's going to call QWhen, which returns a promise. I'm not going to explain a lot about promises, but just understand whoever calls this method is going to expect a promise back. So QWhen is an easy way to return a value wrapped inside of a promise. So data fields exists. I've already got data fields. That's my session variable or global variable. It's an array of all of the fields in my list, and I'm just going to return it. I don't have to call SharePoint more than once to get the data fields. That's what's important here. The first time in, I've got to call this HTTP method. And yes, it's going to be fast, but it has to go back to the server. It might be slow in your environment. But once I've defined it, data fields exists, I'm just going to pass data fields back. So data fields lives inside of this factory as long as a user has a session and is consuming our application. Data fields get set once, it stays set as long as the user is there, and I only have to get it and populate it once, but this code says if it already exists, just pass it back. That's key. So this lets me create a session variable that lives from one controller to another as long as this user maintains the same session. I just keep passing back that same variable I've already defined, which is really, really helpful, especially when you have multiple functions like this where you need to populate all sorts of lookup lists that are used by your main application, and you only want to populate them once. So there's no reason to keep going back to SharePoint for information that isn't going to change while the user's in there. I'm not adding a new field as a part of using this application. So when the user comes in, he may stay there 5 minutes or 10 minutes or an hour in my application. The number of fields isn't going to change. So it's safe to store it in a local variable and let him use it as often as he wants without going back to the well over and over again. Okay, so here's the actual HTTP method. Basically, you just need to understand it's a get method. I'm going to pass in the URL and the /fields, and that's going to go out to SharePoint and return the fields in XML, or actually in JSON. And then the headers say, I want everything, and I want it in a JSON format. JSON is a step up from XML. It's formatted like XML, but JSON lets you store information that's actually user-friendly and understandable. And look how easy it is to parse through it. I get back response from my method, and I've got response.data.d.results. Now I've got my array. If you saw how this looked in using an AJAX call where I have to convert the XML and I have to look for individual XML elements, you see this and you say, hey, that's a whole lot easier. And it's easy to read. You read through this. So I'm looking at the results collection out of my response. I'm doing an Angular for each. This is how Angular does for each. This is the collection I'm looping through. Result is the individual item. And in each case, I'm just taking the result and I'm pushing it to this fields array. And then I'm going to take this local fields array I defined, and I'm going to set data fields equal to it. And I'm returning data fields. So in both cases here, both here and here, I'm returning data fields. This time I created it. This time I'm returning one I already created. And that's basically the factory, and that's it for the Cigars.js file. Well, in this video, we have covered the Cigars.html and Cigars.js files. I think you now have a better understanding of how routing works and how to use a factory to store a session variable that's useful between controllers, although we haven't really showed you what a controller looks like. And you also got a brief introduction to HTTP and the REST API, and we'll explain more about that later on. Cigars.css is a CSS file, as I've mentioned. It's not worth delving into. In the upcoming videos, we will finish out our components looking at the middle column here of how to manage a list of items, and the final column, which is how to handle an individual SharePoint list item. And we'll go into those in more detail. See you soon.